The DIESOL podcast,
Developing innovation in English as a second or other language.
episode 74, Holly Sawyer, coding with ELLs.
Welcome to DIESOL. This is episode 74. We are your hosts. I'm Brent Warner.
And I'm Michelle Reyes, who's no longer going to be a supervisor in 6 business days.
Yeah, you sound excited about swapping your roles, Michelle.
I'm ready. I'm ready to go back in the classroom.
Well, it's hard for us to talk about some of these things because you're like out of the classroom. It's like, let's do this. And you're all excited. And then you're like, oh, but I'm not teaching a class right now. So what do you do?
How have you been?
I've been all right. I was up in the Bay Area last weekend and visiting my nephew, so that was fun. A little time in Berkeley, a little time in San Francisco, a little time in Oakland, and so I got the spread. And prepping for Thanksgiving, I guess, this week too.
Mm-hmm. Well, I will be spending Thanksgiving. I think I'm going to be going to New York. I don't know. I'm not going home to family this year. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing.
Like it's very soon. You don't know if you're going to New York or not?
Maybe driving, not myself, but I don't know. We'll see. We'll talk about it next December.
There's a whole adventure going on here.
There's an adventure. Yes.
Okay. All right. Drive safe, because is there weather on the way to the East Coast?
I haven't checked.
Okay,
I'm living
You're
the
not prepared
risky
to go
life.
to New York at all. All right, well, we'll make the most of this. Speaking of nothing related, let's jump into things.
All right. Today we are going to be talking about coding with ELLs, and today's special guest is Holly. Holly Sawyer first discovered her heart for learning language when she began learning Spanish as a teen in high school. She graduated with a bachelor's in Spanish and then an MA in linguistics, and asked herself where she would go from there. Soon she realized that teaching ESL was the culmination of all those passions. She has taught adult ESL, early childhood, and now has begun her 5th year at Oscar Smith High School at Chesapeake Public Schools. Those kids have her heart. During pandemic teaching, she began to integrate coding into her instruction, and since then has only continued to uncover reasons why coding should be an integral part of English language instruction. She wants to animate educators in the field, how coding is for all, especially English learners, and that teaching coding can be for all, especially multilingual teachers. And this is something that I was very much into a few years ago, and I'm happy to revisit it because I think where I would have gone with this topic is where she has delved even deeper. So welcome, Holly, to the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate your having me here.
Oh, yeah. So, Holly, I have to say, I was just scanning Twitter one day and I came across one of your posts and one of your tweets that had like a YouTube video where you were talking about doing the coding thing with your students, and a little, I'm not sure what the context of the video is, to tell the truth. But I was like, oh my God, this is so cool, right? Because you're like, to kind of start things off, and you're really going to have to share with us what all of this means, but basically in the video you were talking a little bit, it was maybe a promotional video, saying like how you were using coding with your students to teach them English, to teach them coding, to teach them critical thinking skills, like all of these different parts that are all coming together. And it was just such a fascinating thing. So I shared that off with Esol right away, and I'm like, check this out. And she's like,
we got to have her on the show.
And then she's like sending you a message within 2 minutes of like, let's get her on and sort this out. So, so Holly, can you tell us a little bit? Well, let's start with like, what is your concept when a lot of times people are like, coding, that's like hard science, or that's something
or
else.
STEM, and not language learners, that or that's too techie for me, is what I hear.
Yeah. So what's your approach to all this?
Well, it's also sort of odd that somebody like myself with a language background, and I've only ever taught English as a second language, how in the world does this even come about? Most EL teachers, our background is linguistics. We love languages and perhaps literature or English language arts. And so there are very, very few EL teachers in general who do integrate coding because we're not techie. We don't like, or we're not as inclined to math and the sciences perhaps. But it all came about really when we were in the pandemic, and I was doing hybrid teaching, and how in the world was I going to engage my students that were some with me in person and others on the other side of the screen. And I happened to be scrolling across a Facebook group myself, and an EL teacher talked about how she had her students code a TikTok dance that had gone viral, and that through the coding, they learned movement and parts of the body. And I said, oh my gosh, this is it. This would be so much fun. I want to do this. And if I want to do it, then I know my students are going to want to do it and be excited for it too. So I started looking at that point, well, how can I integrate some coding into my lessons? And everybody led me initially to code.org, which is extremely friendly for those who have, for integration, for us teachers who have limited to no experience with coding. And that's one thing that I want to tell all the EL teachers too, is that there's a lot of material and projects pre-made with coding projects. So there's not a lot of like creation that necessarily has to be done on our end in order to support the students with the coding part. Now with the language, yes. So I would front a lot of our lessons with language supports and some direct vocabulary instruction, and it went off from there. In those code.org modules, the students had such a blast. They learned all kinds of cross-curricular vocabulary. We would see the language of science. So like a lot of us EL teachers know about the WIDA standards, the language of science, the language of mathematics, of language arts, and social studies, and social and instructional language. Well, with their game design modules, Flappy Bird, the students learned the elements of a story. So you have your character, you have to create your setting, there's a problem, what leads up to the problem, and how do we get our resolution? And so
okay. I mean, you're already talking in ways I'm like, oh, I never even would have imagined that existed. So there's you even start with storytelling elements there with Flappy Bird. What's the story behind Flappy Bird? Because it's just, to me, I was always like, just frustrate yourself.
You can't make him survive, can you, Britt?
Move yourself.
You know, that feeling of like that frustration where you're like, I'm not gonna make it through. You know, so that's how I feel about Flappy Bird. But I didn't know there's like story elements too.
Sure. Like when they have the students in the modules, they get to select the different elements, and then they get to, on a drop-down menu, they get to see all kinds of different options. So their Flappy Bird could be an underwater, going through an underwater scene. Okay. They could have their Flappy Bird character go faster or slower. And so that opens up to talking about
comparatives and superlatives and
yes, absolutely.
That's amazing. So okay, so one, I mean, for me starting off, I'm just like, okay, I'm laughing here because you're like, the barrier to entry is not the coding, it's the English language, which is of course right. Go figure. Talk a little bit more about what happens when you look into code, like. How did you structure it when you actually started looking at that and saying, okay, well, what do I want to work with for my students? And how did you make your choices around what you were going to be coding or what you were going to be sharing with your students?
Well, Hmm. Well, one thing that I did look at, well, is their curriculum is really structured with a series of puzzles and modules that the students work their way through. And then at the end of the series, they'll have sort of what would be like a culminating project. And so I would look at the modules and look at the language demands and then see how can I support the students in understanding this language before we go into coding. And that follows actually a coding principle that first you would work with these concepts in an unplugged manner. So in a more real life unplugged manner. And then later, and a second part, you would go into the coding and you would have them work through their series of tasks there.
What do you mean by an unplugged manner? Like, you mean like on paper, or what does that mean?
It can mean a variety of things. So when I was, for one project that I did with my students, it was simple directions like move forward, turn left, turn right, move backwards. So for the unplugged portion, we discussed the vocabulary, and then I gave them a task to find and assign right directions for an assigned place in the school. And so the students, we broke them up into groups of 3 or 4, and they had to say move forward, move forward, move forward, turn left, move forward, move forward, move forward. So they also got to see like the repetition that can be cumbersome in coding. But then when they were done with that, when they were done writing their directions, they had to hand their directions over to a different group, and the group had to follow them and hopefully end up at the same place and then take a selfie. So that was the unplugged portion.
Okay.
It's almost like just a real life, what we already are doing in ESL.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was thinking I've done that activity where I've rearranged desks in my class and built a little maze for the students to get through without tapping the desks as they're walking through. Like one gets blindfolded and another student says like, hey, step forward, turn left, turn more, those types of things. So this is turning that activity. That is the activity. That's just coding, though. That's recognizing that an activity like that actually is coding.
Exactly. And then from there, when we return, they already have interaction with the language and with the concept of algorithms or writing a list of directions and how one wrong direction can totally throw off the algorithm. It can, and then when they move into coding and they're coding their little character on the screen, they have that experience, and it helps them understand and it informs their coding experience.
Holly, you mentioned this activity, and it reminds me of a colleague that recently did something with, again, we're teaching adult learners at my workplace, but part of their curriculum is they have to be able to tell directions. So he uses a programmable little car, and then they've got, he has a mat and they have to end up at the direction where he says. And I'm just thinking, well, you just demystified what coding is, because we're already doing that in whatever shape or form. And I know that in your blog, you talk about block coding. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how block coding is related to chunking in terms of a language approach.
Sure.
And first describe what block coding is, because I'm guessing there's people that don't know.
Yeah. Demystify that one too.
There's different coding languages that are out there, and most of them are going to be more complex than what we would probably what a beginner would start off with. And my goal is to introduce coding to my students as an introduction. I don't want it to be a complete another language necessarily that they have to learn. What most technology platforms start students off with is this thing called block-based coding. And so it simply uses different colored blocks with the grouping of words there. So one group might say move forward. And then another, to use that same example, another block might say turn left, blank degrees. And so to me, and a lot of the research shows as well, and I've seen the benefit of this, is that that's how we learn language. We learn languages in phrases and in collocations. We have groups of words that we learn together. We don't learn them in isolation, like word,
right,
sentence. Mm-hmm. That's not how we learn language. And so coding naturally taps into that for our students, and it presents these groups of words together and that are color coded on top of it. And it's a tremendous support.
So how do your students, the first time, because I mean, you're talking about basically doing a high flex setup, right? You had some students in person and some students at home to start. How did your students, one, I mean, that's amazing to even make that effort, so congratulations there. But two, how did your students respond to it, right? Like that's a, you know, some of them are behind the screen kind of working by themselves, and some of them are in the room with you. How did you make that work for them?
That was really tough, to be honest. And it was so clear that the benefits of in-person instruction, when they would come across an area where they needed clarification, I could immediately look on their screen and say, oh, well, let's try this. Or what do you think here with this? Whereas the students on the other side of the screen, I couldn't intuitively see on their faces that they were getting frustrated, or that they had to ask for help. They had to physically ask for help, pause and raise their hand on the other side of the screen. And so it wasn't perfect. It wasn't great. I was super thrilled to have them all back in person when the time came. But it's also, like, to me, it made it clear that having somebody beside you can be extremely beneficial in working out problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's also known in computer science as peer programming. That's actually a strategy they want. And to me, I was like, ooh, that's interactive, isn't it? To have two students working side by side together to figure out a problem.
Mm. I love that. And I mean, this is something big time that I found too, is like how much time I spent trying to explain something fairly simple online, right? Versus when I'm sitting next to the student, it's like a 6-second, you know, like a little quick thing. And then I've literally had some things that I could do in 30 seconds and then 20 minutes trying to explain it through online. So that's a big challenge, but it's a great learning opportunity, right? For you and for them. I guess that frustration might be visible when their camera just suddenly goes off and they log out or throw their computer across the room, right? But so here then you've got these students and you're going into, I mean, if you can explain this a little bit, because to me, I don't know, I was talking to Esol kind of before you logged in about, I would love to do stuff like this. I would love to explore some things like this, but I'm not sure that it fits into my curriculum, right? Like I'm teaching a writing class and I'm teaching a conversation class, right? And I have, you know, plans and things that we have to go through. Are you sliding them in as activities? Are you building them in? Like, is it a core part of the curriculum throughout the whole semester? Is it a coding class that has ESL support, or is it an ESL class that is functioned on coding? You know, like, because I think people are going to want, like, there might be people listening going, I'm not able to do this for whatever XYZ reason. And I'd love to hear how your overall setup is going.
Sure. The way that my class works is it's an English language development class. So it's not a coding class or an intro to robotics or any of that. We do have that at my high school, but this is essentially an English language development class. And I'm lucky in that there's a lot of freedom given to us in order to identify what would be best for our students at this time in terms of language development. But when I integrate, my goal is to integrate one coding project a semester.
Okay.
Mhm.
So that's really how it plays out. Now that very first semester when we were virtual, and I spent the whole semester on code.org. But then when we returned, I had applied for a grant for little car robots because I wanted them to be able to touch, and see physically the result of the code that they wrote online.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did a unit within the larger semester of robotics and intro to coding.
Okay. Okay.
And then also I did a different one, a little, the following semester. And then this semester, I did an animate your name project with CS First for Google, which was tied into a names and identity unit.
Oh, you gotta walk us through that.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. Because now, I mean, and I have all these other questions about projects you have, but please talk about that.
Well, with the names and identity unit, we read Sandra Cisneros' My Name, Mi Nombre vignette, which is part of House on Mango Street. And from there, they went into they presented on how their name is significant to them and what symbols would represent their name and what memories are associated with their name and that are truly a part of who they are and their identity. And so from there, after we went through that large portion of the unit, which was about 2-3 weeks, from there we went into, now let's animate our name. Let's extend that into a creative expression of how we can make our name an animation feature.
That is really.
It was a great project. So when we went into the coding section, that took like another 2 weeks, and we took one lesson for each letter. So I took it slow. I have newcomers. I have students who just arrived a day or two prior, and so I didn't want to push them too fast and too far. We would look at, for example, for one day, going back to comparatives, we would look how we can make the letter grow larger and then make the letter grow smaller. So we talked about how it was larger than before and now it's smaller than before. And so they got exposed to that language of size and comparatives, as well as some math, because they had to place the letter on the grid. And we were able to talk about the x-axis and the y-axis and how when we increase the number, the letter moves up, and when we decrease the number, the letter will shrink down.
I love how just the project like that touches on so many other areas that sometimes ELs aren't getting the time for. I think it's, you've got art, you've got culture, you've got math, you've got obviously the STEM portion of it, but then language. And I know in your blog, you talk, it feels like you're talking, as I'm reading it, it reads to me like the teacher who wants to take the risk and try some of this, but they're afraid to take the risk. And you talk about how a robot doesn't get to a place by itself. You've got to do repetitive motions and try again. And that's just the same thing we do with language. We have students repeat. And just the fact that you're repeating that over and over is giving students time to practice language. You have here in your blog, which we'll link in the show notes, you have sort of like this grid with, it's a kind of like what you mentioned might be an unplugged activity where you've got items on the grid and you might have someone give directions to different icons. And so I think that, so from this kind of material, you said that after you used code.org and then you delved into a little bit more. If someone were already doing something like this, what's another step further to maybe personalize the materials? Or I imagine that as you found more, that you decided to personalize it for the areas that you wanted to focus on.
Sure thing. Um, I'm still new at all of this myself, and so it's my goal to try a different coding platform every semester or focus. And so that's one reason why I went with CS first for Google this semester. And what's the question again? I'm sorry.
Oh, what other resources are you finding? So you're the teacher that has made the step, that has taken the plunge, that is loving it and finding out results, but is still exploring. So what's next? What after code.org, what other things can you do to personalize?
I think one thing that I would tell an EL teacher is that there's a lot of money district for coding and robotics, and a lot of districts in their computer science department would already have something like the little Edison robots. So it might be if they were interested in moving from a code.org project to the Edison robots, they could reach out to their district to see if they could put in contact with some of their computer science teachers to see if they have those materials for them. I really enjoyed the Edison robots, and so did my students, because then they could, after they wrote the code, they would upload the code to their robot, and then they would let it go and see if the code worked like they had initially thought. So robotics is fun, and I highly recommend the Edison robots. And that is also another side note, like you can integrate parts of the city and so I had them on large poster paper. They created their own city, and then they had to make their car move from this part of the city to the parking lot without jumping over the road and knocking out a pedestrian. So they were drawing and creating their own cities. We were able to talk about what buildings are in a city, and they just had a grand time with that. And then I was able to see truly like what artists some of my students are. They were creating beautiful, gorgeous cities. Students, like I said, who had just been with us for a couple of months, and ones that reflected their homes, plazas, in the center, beautiful, gorgeous cathedrals that they would show me the original pictures of from back in Guatemala. And so those are some ways that they can personalize this idea of coding. It seems on the surface that it would not be personalizable, but it can be.
So
sure.
let's clarify a little bit, just to make sure. So anyone listening, the Edison robots that you're talking about, can you describe what they actually are? Like what are they physically? Because they're car robots, kind of, right?
Yeah, they're car robots, and you can put Legos on them too. And they're maybe like this size of a little bit smaller than a cell phone, and they're just grand fun.
So I'm thinking
they have some pre-loaded programs that you can put with them immediately, and so that was a way for my students to see like, ooh, this could be really fun. So it introduces them to barcode programming. We all know barcodes. We go to Kroger and we scan the barcodes. Well, it showed them that the barcode they would have upload that to the robot could upload an entire program, which was different from coding where you're listing out all of the steps and creating the program. So that was a different expression of coding. That's fun. And then CS First for Google is pretty accessible for students. One thing I like with them is that they have a lot of video tutorials that you can download. So I would download their video tutorials, and I would embed a la like Edpuzzle or Nearpod, embed some comprehension questions. And that would be our listening portion of the lesson, is looking at the tutorials. There's ways to integrate the other domains as well, like with speaking. one thing that it's constant in coding is coming up against problems. Like one little error can throw off the whole algorithm, and it can be frustrating. And so we co-created together, my students and I, a problem-solving phrases, right? What do you say in Spanish when you have a problem? Like, and then we would translate it into English. And so they had this list of problem-solving questions, and then problem answering stems. And so they knew that if they were going to ask for help, they had to ask using the guide which we had created together. So that was a big support in terms of the speaking aspect of coding.
So I'm already thinking, Brent. So in my workplace, I get students maybe for 1 week. There's intake, and it could be 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 week. But I can already see how I could do like the thing at the end of the week that they get to do, and they would be either practicing with blocks to code. But I can see I could probably try to incorporate some of these, which I think that's the challenge in my particular workplace.
Yeah. I'm thinking about that too.
I'm thinking right now, like, ooh, how can I get this in there? How can I get this in there? Because we're a very fast-paced intake and graduate, but it can be done. I know it can be done.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of parts here that are super interesting. And Holly, I mean, there's so many ways we can go with this conversation, but one of the things I wanted to kind of talk to you about, because I think that it's important to kind of recognize, we can decipher it and pull it out from some of your example lessons and the things that you've been talking about. But you also, on your blog, you have a pretty direct thing that, like a infographic about why should we teach coding to ELs. Do you mind if I just kind of give the little titles that you give, and then you could kind of speak on those for a minute?
Yes.
So let's start with you start with the first one. It said skill, right? So the very first one is just skill. What do you mean by skill, and why we should teach it?
Well, there's going to be a lot of job opportunities, and there's in the future, in the very near future, there's job opportunities now as they exist, with that are going to demand to have coding as a background. And so, I mean, it exposes our students to those kinds of to coding and to skills that they will need. One of them could even be to have a tolerance for problem solving. That could be a skill that they need to work on.
Like persistence, and then frustration, right? I'm thinking about that right now.
Because the goal isn't necessarily for all of my students to leave with, and enter into the computer science field. That's not going to be the goal. The goal is for them to, in the end, become better versions of themselves. And so by practicing in these little micro opportunities, with coding, how they can build up their capacity for engaging with problems, how they can develop persistence and resilience with a new skill, that in and of itself is what I'm going for.
Excellent. So the next block in your infographic is building equity. So how is coding related to that?
Well, historically, it hasn't been as available to students without the money and opportunity. I think that's starting to change as we're seeing large tech companies reach out to support nonprofits like Code Virginia and to provide that education. But this is the real cool part, is that they all have us as teachers. And so we can be the front line, the very first experience that they have in coding. And I think that's a tremendous way to open up pathways for our students.
Nice. So the next one is you're talking about project-based learning.
Yes, especially in my district right now, they're looking towards moving away from traditional exam assessments, multiple choice, and into more project-based learning, and that is coding. It's you're creating a product, and you're following the steps throughout, and they are super proud of the product that they create. So it's a wonderful way to assess them without giving them, matching or multiple choice and those kinds of form.
That's awesome that your district is doing
Yeah.
that, because not everybody gets that, right? And people have to kind of sneak it in some ways.
You also talk about how it's for all. What do you mean by that?
So there is a movement that coding can be for all. Coding is for all. It's not just for, the Google execs out there. It's just something that all students can and should do. And I 100% agree with that. But because of the reasons that we have discussed even just tonight, it is especially for multilingual learners. It's especially for English language learners because of the it's endless, and I'm continuing to uncover it, right? But like what I mentioned with the block-based coding, it's already tapping into a process that they're experiencing with language learning, right? How are we learning language? We're learning it in groups and word groups and in phrases. It's also, we all know that the bilingual brain functions differently. Well, they don't call it coding languages for nothing, and so it also taps into their natural how would I express that? Their connections, truly, that they're making when they're learning another language and when they're also learning something that's languagey.
Yeah, because you're decoding oftentimes, and you're trying to figure out where the pieces fit together. I could totally see that.
Yeah.
And another thing that's amazing with coding is that when they're writing out an algorithm and early coding, like what I was mentioning before, move forward, they start to recognize that there's a pattern here. And why are we saying this so many times? There's got to be a way we can do that that's more efficient and better. And so then you introduce the concept of loops. Well, what is a loop? Well, let's put move forward in a loop and then put times 7. And so they're also getting exposure to those basic mathematical concepts that, we use multiplication to reduce problems and to make life more efficient.
You're reducing redundancy. Also, I could start saying,
yeah, well,
thinking,
and I'm already getting into like
I'm getting ideas like, oh man, I got to try this.
All right. So then next up, and this one is particularly interesting to me, is cross-curricular discipline.
Yes. Coding and computer science, it naturally lends itself to integration across the disciplines. That social and emotional language, dealing with frustration, persistence, problem solving, it's very rich, language heavy with that. What I mentioned with the language of language arts, where a student can go into story elements with game design. And then the language of science, for example, in one of the code.org modules, we talked about natural and natural resources, looking at their Minecraft modules, right? And so that inputted some content vocabulary, and then they got to extend into the gamifying. And so it continues like art. Coding is very, very artsy. It's not the expression there, but talking about symmetry and how we can create a beautiful symmetrical pieces by using art. Going into math and talking about we need the character to move us X number of degrees, and so the student will have to increase or decrease it based off of what they see happening there. So It's extremely cross-curricular, and that's what we teach. Well, especially in my course and in my school, we are in English language development. We dip a little bit into the different content objectives.
So you mentioned already a little bit about in block-based programming. You mentioned the similarities to language, but what other areas is coding similar to, it's a language.
Well, one is that it is about communication. So it is a human interacting with a machine. Now with natural language, we have a human interacting with another human. And so one benefit of teaching coding is that it removes that second human, and they get to practice without all of the background, the noise, the experiences, and the judgment even that they may be concerned about with the other human. So it lowers their affective filter, and they get to see immediately what if their communication was successful or if they needed to try again. And so it brings about this element of communication, and it's still by removing that second human, it gives them practice with a similar concept.
Yeah, I can totally see like taking the risk of having to give directions. One of the tasks my students have to do is that they have this interview. It's a high stakes interview. They've got to be able to give directions to a place. And, sometimes they'll want to memorize, but then the person interviewing them knows that they are giving you this memorized language because it's not natural. But removing that fear and feeling confident, I think that coding does that for them. It sounds like to me,
right? They're going to use language with another person. They are, but then it gives them sort of a break.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, what I was thinking as you're explaining this too is like, I feel guilty sometimes talking to my students because I understand what they're saying so well, and other Americans might not, right? Because I'm so used to dealing with language learners, right? And so like they'll say something and it's like a half a broken sentence, and I'll be like, yeah, let's do this and this, and it's like, and it's not really fair in certain ways because they're getting the benefit of your ear. my humanness being able to interpret what they mean, and then they don't necessarily build the accurate. I mean, obviously as a teacher, I'm responding to this, but like in certain side conversations and things, they're not benefiting from the accuracy that would get lost in coding. It would be accurately done in coding, but it would be lost inside of the communication between two humans, right? And so I might say, hey, I totally get what you're saying, and I always got to give the example. I say, but if you go to Starbucks and you're talking to, your average American who maybe doesn't spend a lot of time dealing with
or doesn't speak other languages,
or language learners or any of those things, they can sometimes be quite rigid in their understanding of things, right? And that is also, it gives students a chance, I would think, through doing this to say like, okay, my language, my coding language, but my English language through the coding language is going to either get the response I'm looking for or it's not. And that value of accuracy, can be a really powerful lesson for the students as well. Last one here is that it teaches how to think.
This is one of my favorite ones, so that's why I kept that for last, and I delved into that ESol. So one of the first lessons that I taught was the Code.org had this video of Steve Jobs saying that everybody in this country, and I'm thinking, ooh, I already like this. Everybody in this country, okay? Everybody in this country should learn computer science because it teaches you how to think. And I was sort of thrown back for a second. I said, wait a second, I know how to think. What do you mean I need to learn how to think? And what does this mean? And so, but very soon I was able to unpack what that meant as I was interacting with my students. But also there's a whole field of what kind of thinking is required in computer science and what kind of thinking is required of programmers. And it's known as computational thinking. Well, what does that even mean? I mean, it can mean having that growth mindset that we're going to continue even though it's not accurate yet. It's what you mentioned earlier, Brent, about precision and how the necessity of precision in coding and an algorithm. And then also this idea of algorithmic thinking or directions, right? What comes first? Then what comes next? And then what comes next? And thinking truly carefully about all of the minute directions that are required in order to get a computer to do what you want. It can be quite tough. I mean, a lot of people, when they do how-to videos, they often think of how to make a peanut butter jelly sandwich, right? And so they have the bread, they have the jelly, and then first you get the knife, then you lift the knife up, then you dip the knife into the peanut butter, then you turn it, and they have to think, okay, if I'm going to be explaining this to an alien from Mars, how would I write out all of the steps without it being a total chaos? And so it makes students start to think along details, the details that are required when they express themselves. And so that's one way that it teaches them how to think too.
That is really cool. Again, I am going back to the classroom soon, so I am promising to our audience here that I'm going to try something because it's a challenge and I love a challenge. We are going to link all of your resources in the show notes. You've got the blog. I encourage our listeners to check it out. It is very encouraging to hear from a teacher who's taken the risk and is finding and is discovering really. There's also a Padlet that you've put together with all of your resources that you to point teachers and what to do. So we'll have those in the show notes.
And one of my favorite things here, as we're wrapping out of this section, Holly, is hopefully inspiration to other teachers who are listening, because I love talking to people who are still kind of in the thick of figuring things out, right? And like that part is important to kind of say like, hey, because people when you talk to about these different ideas, it's like, oh well, I can't do that, like it's hard, or it's that person's been doing it for years and years and years, and so they've been able to build it all out, but I can't really do that. And so I really appreciate that you're new to this or relatively new and sharing it and trying to figure that out. I think that's really important and impressive. And so thank you for sharing all of these things.
It's my pleasure. I like to learn. I see it as learning beside my students. If they come up with an issue in their algorithm and I don't understand, then it brings about the opportunity to talk about like, well, let's figure this out together.
I love it. Awesome. Okay, we're going to wrap out here and jump over to Fun Finds.
All right, it is time for our Fun Finds. And I guess by now maybe people have heard of this, but my fun find recently is Mastodon. the Twitter.
Talking of coding, you have to have we talked about this last time. You have to have like a degree in engineering to figure out Mastodon.
But I'm finding over the previous the last week, because we talked about this about a week or so ago. I've been finding more of my teacher people signing up, and so it's like rediscovering microblogging. And again, it's maybe Twitter isn't forever. Maybe there is something after Twitter, and maybe there's something in conjunction to Twitter. So I've found a bunch of the big names out there. And so I'm looking forward to exploring how I explore this new tool. So I'm over at Mastodon. I'll put my handle that is super long in the show notes.
I'm on there too, so we'll add mine as well. I just haven't figured
when Brent
it out.
learns how to make it.
So come follow me or find me, and I'll follow you back, and we'll figure it out kind of together. And that's the theme of the show. Let's figure it all out together, right? Okay, so mine. As I mentioned, I was up in the Bay Area. Food's expensive up there, but I'm gonna just talk about a restaurant anyways. We went to a bunch of different restaurants and things, but one that we went to was I don't even remember the name of it, but the chicken was it was called Vaughn's Chicken, like Vaughn's, same as the supermarket, but Korean fried chicken. Oh man, it was outstanding.
I love Korean fried chicken.
Korean fried chicken is so. I mean, I love the Japanese fried chicken too, but like the Korean fried chicken with that double fry and that extra crispiness, and then that tangy sauce that they put on top of it. So, anyways, if you're up in the Bay Area, it was actually in Oakland that we went to, and the chicken, I can't remember the name of the place, but the chicken was called Vaughn's Chicken. I'll put it in the show notes. I'll go Google search it. I'll figure it out. But anyways, wherever you are, go find some good Korean fried chicken. It will make your evening if you're able to eat chicken.
Holly, you've got a fun find for us too.
Yes, making my way from Richmond back down to Virginia Beach, there's this beautiful road known as Route 5, and on this road, it's been pretty much untouched for hundreds of years, and there's historic homes, there's restaurants, and beautiful bike paths, and you get a touch of a early Virginia history when you drive on down. And so that's a lot more preferable than hopping on the interstate. I think it might be worth the extra few minutes. And I think that all Virginians need to make that a regular destination.
Take the scenic route, Route 5.
Awesome. Love it.
All right. If you are on any of the social media platforms and you're giving us a shout out, just tag us. If you're trying out any of what you've learned in any of our episodes, let us know. We want to know what you're doing, how you're doing it. If you have questions, tag us. We're constantly checking.
How do they tag us on Mastodon? Is there tagging in there?
We don't have these. DIESOL DIESOL pod will have a Mastodon, okay? Ooh. But you can find Brent and I, yeah. Okay. I mean, we've got Clubhouse and TikTok, so why not?
Yeah, might as well. Awesome. Of course, we do have a Patreon if you want to support the show in any way. No obligation, of course. So we just love it that you're listening. But if you want to support, we do have Patreon. You can find it on the website. And of course, you can find the show notes for this episode, including links to Holly's blog, Padlet, all the other things that you've been putting together, Twitter and everything. Everything is at diesel.org/74. That's the number 74. And of course, you can listen to us at VoiceEd Canada. That's voiced.ca. Still on Twitter, as long as things haven't completely blown up, I guess. So the show is at DieselPod. I am at Brent G. Warner.
I am at IXY_Pixie. That's IXY_PIXY. And you can find Holly
at Holly Sawyer ESL.
Awesome. Holly, are there any other places that you want people to find you, or is that the best for now?
That's probably it for now. Okay. I'm just starting, so now have to look into all of these other places that you guys are pointing to.
Oh, good. So we've all overwhelmed each other, which is nice.
Yeah. In Spanish, thank you is gracias. Gracias for tuning in to the podcast.
Thanks, everybody.
See you.